I would like to start for the final part of this afternoon with a panel discussion, which is always a complicated format, having a row of people speaking to the audience and maybe also speaking to each other. I realize that I didn't ask Pina and Niall to come up with a subject for the panel discussion, so maybe you could think about it for a minute and we can use it as the second subject. Because I have first a general one. I'm not an architect, I'm not a developer, so I'm a total outsider. I'm not from Toronto, so I can speak freely. I notice is that if I listen to developers, if I speak to architects, it always seems that somewhere else is the power. The power is never in the hands of the person I'm speaking to. So it's almost like this Mexican standoff where you have the market, which is forcing developers to do things. The developers forcing architects to do things. The architects are doing something like pointing a gun at the city, so the city is the victim of that. So where's the power, according to you? And what would we need to increase the quality, the built environment, to higher the standard of dwelling in Toronto?
I can go first.
Yeah, please.
I think the powers are the people, the purchasers.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, they're the ones who are going to talk about the success or failure of our given communities. Mm-hmm. And just, in terms of the dynamic, I mean, I think it's a wrong proposition to go into it with an us and them mentality. We are a complicated city. It's a complicated regulatory, heavily regulated, environment. I think everybody, rightly so, should have a say. I think part of the frustration you'll hear from the developer side of the equation is just the constantly shifting landscape on the approvals, on the timelines, on the demands for critical review. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in meetings, across not just a Toronto phenomenon, but a GTA-wide phenomenon, where you have somebody who doesn't have, they're junior, they're learning their craft, and I get that, and they're making, in essence, demands through that regulatory process for something, that we don't think is right or appropriate, and we have a very seasoned team, and that's a tough dialogue, but it's not to suggest that we should ultimately have a hammer and say, no, this is ridiculous. I mean, I think you need to have a dialogue to kind of work through all of that. So I don't think it's essence, coming down to a power per se. I think that we all make our decisions. Our craft is formed by making 1,000 decisions, and ideally you're on the right side of those more often than not, and you have an offering that goes to the marketplace, be it an ambitious program like this, or be it some grade-related towns, be it a mid-rise, be it a small unit, be it a large unit, and the market's going to tell us. I mean, did we make all those right decisions? Is this the right building? Is the context correct? Is the market correct? Is the sizing correct? Is the spec? I mean, all those sorts of things. And I think that we're a richer city for looking at the dialogue in such a way.
Mm-hmm. I just want to, because I can't help myself on this. I actually did 2 projects in Holland, and I was amazed that the process was not dissimilar to Toronto or Canada in terms of zoning and public meetings. And I would give these public meetings in English, and they would very graciously translate them into Dutch. But what I found quite profoundly different, was that there is a very established design culture in Holland and in Western Europe that doesn't exist here, and is just starting to come, I would say. So I would agree somewhat with what Niall just said, that it's ultimately the customer. And what we're seeing in Toronto is an emergent interest in design in the kind of millennial generation that I refer to. And in my presentations in Holland, they would challenge me to do a better job. Even the city councillor would say, I think, this design could be racked up. Here it's very adversarial because everyone's reacting to this thing that we don't really want this. This is not real. We don't want our city to change. But it's these younger generations coming in saying, no, we kind of like it. We think it's kind of cool. So I'm sort of optimistic that it will change. And you're right, everyone blames everyone else. If only I could do a better job. But I think it starts with the people who want to live in these buildings, and they are going to determine, in a way, how the city moves forward in the quality of design.
But now you're mentioning 2 points. One is what you describe as a kind of immaturity of a design culture, kind of.
Yes.
And the other one, conservatism.
Well, the conservatism of, yes, you're right. It's two. It's two. You're absolutely right. Toronto embraced modernism around 1958 to about 1965, and then was like, oh, no, modernism never happened. Let's just put that away. You know, and the great patrons, Meg talked about doing private houses. Architects love private houses because there's a lot, usually by wealthy people who will spend a lot of money doing a beautiful house. Normally, they will do, you know, a chateau or some kind of historical building, and that's the conservatism. You're absolutely right. It's those two things.
But then, are you implying as well that the majority, the market, is not necessarily right?
Open the door, Peter. You know that.
Yes.
That's a clear answer. So maybe Neil.
I think almost by the time it gets.
I think I just got trapped.
I think by the time it gets to the purchaser level, it's almost too late. I don't know if the power is with the purchaser. I think as developers, we think we have the power, at least initially. We've got the property. It's we've got a clean slate, and we say, okay, we want this many stories, this many units, and we go to the architect, and then the architect will kind of cut us down a notch and say, no, you can't do that, you can't do that. Then we'll meet with the city, who will then strip a little more power away, meet with the community, more power away, and then the lenders. And you're almost left with this form that was not really what you'd wanted, and that's really only what you can build. And then you have to take that to the purchaser and say, okay, well, I've designed these units as best as we could under this framework. I hope you like it. So I don't think not to disagree with you, Neil, but I think the power is not so much, at least these days.
What happens if they don't like it, though?
Well, in this city, they have no choice because there's so much demand and relatively little supply. Maybe at some point the balance will shift. But as developers, we're almost fortunate in that way that we almost can't make a mistake. I know I'm young, I heard that. But I did live through the recession. I was young, but I was in the recession.
It's a young guy speaking.
But in any event, that's kind of my take on it.
David?
I think that I think there is, ultimately, if you had to choose, there is power with a developer. There's also risk, right? So you have the power to screw up, but you do fear. And I also think that Toronto is a pretty unique market for how much is going on here and how many forces are at play here. So, because I've developed in about 5 or 6 cities, and this one is pretty, it's got its own situation going on.
Can you be specific about that? What's going on?
What I mean is that there's, it's the hypermarket. There's so much going on, so there's many forces, and it's, it has a very advanced planning regime. You might say it's not doing this, or it doesn't have a cohesive. The planning regime does have a cohesive, I think, idea. It's just that they can't execute it for many, many reasons, including the OMB and staffing and all that kind of stuff. And you have your purchaser base can be individuals, but it's also agents and brokers, and they have their own agenda. So there's a lot of things happening in this market, and and unlike other, at least Canadian markets, but I was just in Philadelphia looking at some sites for some people, and that market is so unadvanced. I mean, anything you want to build in that city will get built, right there, and other Canadian cities are the same thing. Not anything, but pretty there's
almost.
So I'm just saying that we are experiencing a very unique moment in time in this city, and there's many forces at play here. So power is diffuse, but if you had to pick one, I do think the developer tends to have more power, but more risk.
Anybody else? Yeah, Meg?
I mean, I want to take a slightly more philosophical approach or a different tack, which is to say that I think that there's a lot of power in planning. And although I think in some cases we have clear planning regulations, I agree that we're not we can't always. They're not always able to enact those. But I think in other cases, just through lack of resources, the planning department can't always keep up with, we know that they can't keep up with the kind of pace of development in the city. And so, if we were able to actually, if the city was able to actually get out ahead of more ahead of where we are right now, then there would be more, there might be a little, if even only a little bit more clarity around the process and the expectations, or what can be done on individual sites and within individual neighborhoods and on avenues and things like that. There might, the approvals and the kind of flow of development might be a little bit cleaner, a little bit smoother, and I think that would. I think give kind of more power to the overall vision of the city, or there would be a power to that vision of the city that we don't currently have in a kind of holistic way.
There's three.
Take the microphone again.
Sorry. There are 3 letters that I've just realized screw up good design. IRR, the internal rate of return. The guys who give you money, the people who give you money, want to get their money turned around quickly and want to make a lot of it. And so the time, he knows this because the other day I went into his office, I was like, I need this building tomorrow because it's a lot of money that we're putting up and it's got to get to work. Mm-hmm. And he's sick. So he's like, but I still need it tomorrow. That is the biggest stress for maybe someone like me. It's that you're trying to do something good, but you don't really have the time. And I think that's this part of everything that's going on in this city. There's just no time.
But then would you say that streamlining the approval process would alleviate your stress?
It helps, but there are cities where it takes 5 years to get an approval. I'm not sure that was surprising to me that you said that the Netherlands has an approval process similar to ours, because I have these partners from Israel, and they have a project that's taking 10 years to get it approved in Tel Aviv. And that's, and I've heard about European cities. So I don't know.
Holland's a relatively young, it's not a young country, but it appears young in terms of it's got a lot of recent development. It's not like central Paris or central London or something.
Right. I would say that it would help for sure, of course, but everything is the conversations I have with people who are providing me money is like, when can you get it to the market? So we haven't even bought it yet, so that stress has an impact on, and back to my 80% rule, if those people aren't 80% happy at the end of your project, you're not going to do another project again. So you got to listen to them as well.
Yeah. Back to Pina and Niall. What would you raise as a discussion topic for this panel? Because I didn't ask you. We have this approval, mixed use and community, issue of affordability. So maybe you could add another one.
Well, have we had a discussion about affordability?
No.
Because I think as a city builder and as a parent of kids that are graduating school, I think affordability is one of our critical issues as a city that we're facing, and it's a very complicated issue. And there are things that can be done. And
maybe you could start to explain the complexities of it, and then possibly hint at what could be done.
So I just think it's something that we could take all afternoon to discuss. So what I would suggest is to say that all of us have had certain experience when there were federal, provincial programs allowing for the creation of affordable housing. Those days ended in the mid-90s, and there has been no program at all since that period of time. We have had, as has been alluded to, an unprecedented building time, a boom in this, and there is a significant segment that have been left behind. And I think that we need to realize that, and we all need to contribute to some resolution of that. And there is no easy one sort of stop fits all kind of scenario. It's a complicated discussion, and so and it's one that I think that it doesn't behoove us to wait until, you know, Justin Trudeau and Adam want to kind of get funds that will flow, and then therefore we'll get going. I mean, I think there's things that can be done, like we've done with our partners at TCHC. For instance, creating affordable ownership housing and trying to take some of the fees and charges that we face and saying to cities that, you know, defer those charges, wrap them up in a whole separate product that you will then secure via a second mortgage against that specific unit. Let's take that as a notional subsidy. Let's take the market value, reduce it by, and then, you know, have a runway of people that we can take out of, in the case of Toronto, TCHC, out of paying market rent, that actually have good cash flow to be able to support a certain level of debt, and then put them into an affordable ownership unit, which creates a whole host of, you know, public social benefits, and has a, sort of the benefit of a 2-for-1, which then frees up that unit to then immediately be redeployed to against an ever-growing list. I think there's creative things that we can think about along that line. And, you know, the encouraging thing is that we're in discussions right now, you know, with Toronto, with actually Build Toronto, on a site utilizing a very similar formula that will ideally achieve a 30% affordable component, you know, within that community. We're in a similar discussion in the suburban level, so in Mississauga. So in Mississauga and Peel region, which, you know, as any developer will tell you, has a huge burden of DCs, development charges, cash in lieu, fees and charges. And, you know, I get it that the cities need these things, but at the same token, I think that we need to be cognizant of building an inclusive place. And so I think the time is now. There's a political climate to want to be able to tackle that. Would be my kind of topic for discussion.
Yeah. I would just segue that by saying it absolutely lies in that political realm. I think that the key, or those that hold the key, really is in political will to really make this happen, because there is a lot of goodwill, I think, on the part of developers and the whole sort of development industry today because of the fertility, frankly, of our city, right? There is a lot of building happening and there's a lot of opportunity. In the previous discussion, it kind of goes hand in hand with, you know, who holds the power. I agree. I would never pretend to know that. I really don't know who holds the power ultimately. Don't believe that it is in one body, but I do think that the city doesn't know the power it could have, if I had to contribute to that discussion, because it really, it is, I would say, like actually Peter's comment that the culture of design has to sort of catch up to the kind of building that's happening from, but it is catching up, and it's catching up quickly. We see design on the front page of the newspaper more often, you know, than not. And I think that there is an accelerated sort of learning curve, if we want to put it that way, that's happening. But at the same time, I think that the city could be in a position to actually you know, develop a vision and disseminate that vision with all of the applications it receives, and to basically put some policies in place to say, well, this is what we see as a city with affordable housing, and this is how we imagine it. These are the precedents that we are looking at to do that. It feels a bit like that we are trying to say, well, look at how it happens here, rather than, you know, the other way around.
Question here in the back.
Hi. I just wanted to go back to a point that Niall made at the beginning about the buyer and the purchaser having the kind of a lot of the power. And the question is, you know, how is the general public supposed to ask for something that they don't know exists in terms of, you know, alternative building typologies? And to that point, I'm curious about a discussion about where the developers on the panel and the architects on the panel see as the opportunities and points of resistance between more typologically innovative building forms, which may have the possibility to actually impact the standard of dwelling and issues of affordability. Because, you know, with all due respect, a lot of the work that was presented today typologically was fairly conventional in terms of, you know, double-loaded corridors, point towers, and Peter's done a lot of work in specifically 20 Niagara and district lofts that are, push the boundaries a bit more. So I'm curious, in broad terms, today how that can be affected.
Who will? You want to start, Peter?
I could start just as a leader. That's a very good question, very complicated answer. What I was referring to in my little talk was that one of the problems why we morphologically have such homogeneity downtown is because of the tall building guidelines, that they are so prescriptive. And they came out of, I think, they came out of a sense of having a lack of a zoning framework. So we're going to have this density. How are we going to control it so that we don't get street walls that are 35 stories high and so forth? And the city did not have the time, nor can it even really now effectively rezone the central area of the city, because they'll be tied up in the Ontario Municipal Board for about 25 years and about 45,000 landowners. So the horse has left the barn, so to speak. But it's that set of design guidelines that's created this homogeneity and really stifled a kind of creative interpretation of dwelling units. So district lofts, 20 Niagara, another one done for Howard Cohn, Mozo. These were done prior to those guidelines, in which it was more about advocating for development on a site of a particular height, not 45 or 55 or 85 stories, what you thought you might be able to convince the city of at that time. And my criticism of those guidelines is that homogeneity that we're getting. So we're getting, and you say, how do purchasers know what they want if they're only presented with one option and there's others out there? It is absolutely right. The second thing is that those guidelines don't deal with the essential issue, which is that we have a very robust residential market. We should be using that to rebuild a city in a far more compelling way from a public realms perspective. So I think we need guidelines that are more generic about block development and less about individual building development. And then you will get developers, someone will buy a 25-foot piece of property, or they'll buy 3/4 of a block or an entire block, and the responses to the housing will be very different in each of those iterations. But taken together, we'll have a very consistent block structure that's relative to a particular context. So I use often as an example of this when I'm talking about this is Midtown Manhattan, where the zoning regulations are they seem complicated, but they're actually very straightforward. 250 feet on the avenues, 150 feet on the streets in terms of street wall heights, angular plane setbacks to allow light down to the intersections. So it was a very clear idea about what kind of public realm definition New York wanted to create. And it didn't go and codify and say to every landowner, so you can't do a tower because you only have 25 feet. No, you can build a 25-foot wide building. You will form one of the teeth of a larger block. And then, and only then, do I think we'll get more innovative housing. The avenues will never happen in this city because of the power of neighborhoods and their resistance to change. So I live in the east end of the city, which has become a kind of a crazy zone when someone proposes a 4 or 5 story building, heaven forbid. And every single project is fought by neighborhoods because they're very fearful of change. So most of the activity is going to occur within the central area where it is, what I call the future city within the Portlands and Donlands, and then these kind of seam corridors. And that's really where the mid-ride guidelines are fantastic, but they're not practical to implement in terms of the regulatory framework that we have now in any kind of, a time-effective way.
But again, it's a bit like this Mexican standoff. We're expecting somebody else to develop the vision for the city, or should you do it?
Well, I think the great promise is one of the great stewards of this is Waterfront Toronto. And I think that in this, I don't mean this as an unfair comparison between the planning department and Waterfront Toronto, but the planning department is under siege. It does not consider design as a constituent important element in planning, they would disagree, but they don't. There are so many other factors that they have to consider in terms of politics and policy that's determined, within their departments. That Waterfront Toronto is really about design excellence and developing, and they've demonstrated, I think, their ability to develop coherent precinct plans that then can kind of morph into really quite amazing neighborhoods. At least that's the promise. So that, I think, is the hope. And then the downtown will end up just being the battleground until everyone's sort of beaten themselves to pulp and exhausted by it, and there's no sites left. And I don't mean to sound pessimistic about it. It's just the reality of the thing, because it's too late, really.
Yeah.
Too late. David?
I'll go back to the question about types of housing. First of all, we only build condominium types. We don't build townhouses, or we have built townhouses. That's not true. We did Trinity Bellwoods, which introduced a certain style of townhouse. At the time, it was probably one of the biggest modern design townhouse projects in the city, and I think that was forward thinking. I look at. I'll come back to sort of our part, but I look at Liberty Village, which, is the counterpoint, I think, to West Don Lands. Liberty Village doesn't have the benefit of one landowner, Waterfront Toronto, because Waterfront Toronto is not a regulatory agency. They're also an owner. So when I signed my deal with Waterfront Toronto, there is a 7,000-page, I think, document that prescribes everything. And it's written in 5 points, because there's buried in there little tricky things that we found after the fact. But Liberty Village did not have there was no powerful agency that controlled what you could build there. And as a result, you got, we don't need to comment on that, but what is interesting I always found about Liberty Village is the buildings, the towers are kind of modern or contemporary design, but the townhouses are oldie worldy, right? Why? Like, what is that? So there is now, the developer no developer there put a large-scale modern townhouse project on the market. So you couldn't really do a test. I did talk to the developers about it at the time on the basis like, what? But they didn't do it. But I bet if they did, 10% of those townhouses would be modern design and 90% would be faux Georgian, I'm pretty sure. Because that is at least been Toronto to a certain extent. It is starting to change, and I think we're going to have a rapid change in that. As for the unit typology, there are, I think that the last example you showed, Meg, was very interesting. It's very, very interesting, and it would probably so is Habitat, right?
Yeah.
And I just think our River City project is actually not as interesting as it looks. 3 sides of that building are actually orthogonal, and then there's one crazy side. But the units in there are just units. To make that building work, I can just tell you that the developer, being me, has to agree that 30% of your units on that face are not very good, right? They're not very good. They are actually 5,000 square feet. They're 200 feet by 12 or something like that. They stick out. And so, I have to be prepared to say, I'm going to sell those for $400 a foot or $380 a foot to make it work. So what I'm trying to say is that you can put stuff out there that's different, but it's actually not, at the end of the day, tends not to be accepted in the market, or it's so expensive that no one, it's a custom home then, really, effectively, and you have to pay $1 million for it. So I think what Peter said actually resonates with me, is that we are building middle-class housing in Toronto for people who like, a contemporary-looking thing, but they don't want to spend too much on it, and that's ultimately what we're trying to achieve. I actually think we do not a bad job doing it.
Everything comes to an end, and not only this afternoon, my saying
Hans,
this.
can I just piggyback a couple
sure.
of comments? I think that the market is incredibly dynamic. I think that, as evidenced today, you've got a bunch of different builders, architects, developers that are, in a fairly short span of a number of years, are hitting the market with a whole bunch of innovative and different unit types, building typologies. We're talking about one bedrooms at 300 square feet. We're talking about micro units. We have done, as I think others, what I call a convertible unit. So it answers the question a little bit in terms of, you want to provide, I think, while we've done a great job on the smaller units, the bigger stuff has been more of a challenge, and I think we've missed an opportunity. And so one of the things we can do, and we did it at our Cinema Tower building, which was create, right on the floor plan, a convertible unit, kind of 1 bedroom and a den, 1 bedroom and a den, comes together for a really nice 2 and a den or a 3. And so you can have it this way, you can have it that way. And we design it right into the shear wall structure so that it allows for that. Now, my construction guys want to know before they're going to build which way it's going to be. Like that is the Achilles heel, because then it becomes set in stone and enshrined in a condo plan. But the point being, there's creativity here, and I believe, and I think David has been sort of an epitome of this. If we think we can design it and do something innovative, you're going to go do it. You're going to go give it a whirl. And I think that's amazing, that we have that kind of a market. And why I come back to saying I think purchaser is key, because ultimately the market's going to tell us whether or not that is a successful product or not. And if it's something that doesn't achieve a price point, doesn't achieve design excellence, is not something, and what's always cool is you have all this competition. So now you come into an area, be it Liberty, be it Entertainment District, be it Waterfront, and the purchaser has so much money in their pocket, and where do they want to go? Well, this is what they're offering, this is what they're offering, and we live in that market. And that dynamism gets lived every day by us, and I think it's a very, very cool dynamic. One of the things, just coming back to your question a little bit, that we haven't talked about, we've all talked about sort of Toronto examples. One of the things that we've done, for instance, in the suburban context, and I got sort of 2 quick examples I'll talk about, is what we call financially accessible housing, which is taking a townhome typology and pre-building the homes, and pre-building 100 of them, and being able to benefit from saying to trades, this is the design, this is it, give us the best number, because there's no change orders, there's no thinking, let's go do this. And then we actually go on sale when these units are occupiable in 60 days. Now, people have said to me, and people may think, oh my God, that's rolling dice. And I think it's exactly the contrary. I think it's a very interesting dynamic we have, where we lock into revenue in day 1, and we don't know that cost equation until day 300, 400, 500, whatever it is, depending on the complexity of the community. Where we're able to then offer these units, know exactly what they're going to cost. We take all the benefit of then not having to put $1 million sales office and create all these fancy designs, and then we pass that along to the purchaser. So if the market's here, we offer it here. And it's our private sector response to being able to achieve what I call financially accessible, because affordable has a whole bunch of connotations to it, that becomes complicated in the marketplace. Just in terms of then context, I'll flip over to then in Mississauga again. We have a very prominent corner, Erin Mills and Eglinton. We proposed a 42-story building, a beautiful landmark building. And let me tell you, in the suburbs, it didn't go over so well. So that was a very interesting dialogue and dynamic, and I had to make a tough decision. And so I think maybe other developers would think about trotting off to the OMB, but that's really not who we are. And so we've built in that city for 25 years. And so we actually then took the Point Tower, we turned it on its side, and have created a similar expression to what we did at Bayview and Shepherd with a building called ARC. And it will be a very interesting, innovative building. So it's all about context, in that respect. And again, a dynamic response to the fluidity of the marketplace. And I think there's a lot of creativity up here to want to satisfy, which is why I come back to the market's ultimately going to tell us, are we successful or not?
In a similar way as the market is always right, it's also true if you're moderating a conference and one of the panelists is going to leave. It means that, no, it doesn't matter. You have to go. I know that. It means it's time to wrap up. I want to thank you. And then there's one more question for the remaining 5 panelists from
So I
Bridget
thought it was
Chim.
a great discussion. I think the issue of social housing, affordable housing, market housing, really important, because there's a level of social equity in the city that's really missing. I think what's been great is Daniels has been one of the leaders in really thinking about this from a kind of of market perspective in a void where nothing has been happening at the federal level. Huge missed opportunity, and I think it's really important that we catch up. So I just thought it was such an important point that was made that wasn't really part of the broader discussion, probably warrants a whole other symposium in itself.
It could, for sure.
I think that Toronto is so fortunate that we are at such a dynamic point in time. And I was at I sit on the board of Waterfront Toronto. One of its huge successes, I think, is it's led by landscape. And that it's actually built the parks so that the developers actually know what the kind of public realm is. The investment of the public realm is the huge benefit of being in that precinct of the city. And I think design excellence has been their mantra from the very beginning. The use of competitions for those public realm key components has really set the tone for private development, adjacent, cheek by jowl with it. And I think really created, something that played out over the next 25 years we'll be very proud of. And I think that the contribution is a mutual one of public and private working hand in hand. I guess for me, the question is about how design excellence can be linked with density and height. For me, height, there's a huge discussion with the planners about height. That's their big obsession. It's all about a precedent at the OMB, so the next guy will get the same height. But in a way, there isn't a conversation about how real design excellence linked to this height and density. And I think that, there's conversations I know of where Vancouver developers don't have to work as hard in Toronto as they do in Vancouver because we don't set the bar high enough. And in a way, I think that it's a really big issue that we can all do better, so that there is a balance. And I think the issue of describing the many players that are involved, it's no one person has all the power. Clearly, it's a kind of mutual pushing and shoving and nudging and all of the above all at the same time. But I would say the design community, I think, has to step up because many of the kind of towers that I see are pretty banal. They could be better. They could actually be more thoughtful as building elevations. The issue of inside to outside, big questions about unit type, the diversity of unit type. So I think that in a way, I guess I feel like Toronto is a very, because it's so dynamic, it actually can use more variety than it currently has. I think the students in our school are both your designers, but also they're your audience, they're your market, because they're ahead of the curve, they're totally smart, talented, together, and they're gonna want more than just the same old, same old. So I think we're at an interesting point in time where on one hand, the market is the market, for sure, but in the end, maybe you need to be ahead of the market to actually capture, in effect, the kind of the new wave and to really project a future city as opposed to going with the status quo that we already have. So I think it was a great conversation, but I guess I just feel that we should be challenging using design more and creating higher expectations to really be the leader as opposed to just following what the market says.
Can I do one last point too? And I think the other thing to be very cognizant of, which we're starting to see a lot of, that the tall building guidelines recommend a 12 or a 25 meter separation between tall towers. And we're getting a lot of instances, or we're getting more and more instances downtown where that's not occurring. We have to think very carefully too. So public realm doesn't just exist at the ground plane. Public realm is all the way up. So if you're 12 meters away from somebody, think about that. 12 meters away, you're looking right into their bedroom, or they're looking right into your living room. And what I think, I know in the commercial sector, at least one building where, they're having actually trouble leasing one side of the building because it's too close to the building adjacent to it. So part of that forward thinking is very much about it's about the design of the buildings, but we've got to think very carefully about the design of the space and the fact that whether we get there are streets now that are in danger of not getting any sunlight at all, or all for like 3 hours a day or something like that. So it's this much broader kind of, we have to think of it as a very spatial equation, not just one that exists again at the ground plane, but that is all the way up, and making great streets is also about making great communities, and that kind of, who wants to be living that close to somebody right across the street from them?
I suggest that we conclude the conversation here. We continue outside. We have snacks.
We're back at 6 for Michael.
Exactly. the reception right now. I want to thank you as the audience for participating in this, and I want to thank the speakers for their effort and energy.